But had the change been felt and recognized elsewhere? Were his sworn enemies aware that the Force had been shifted irrevocably? Can't say that word.
Irrevocably. Irrevocably.
Irrevocably. Can you guys say that
Irrevocably.
word better than I can?
Irrevocably.
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 I think it lends itself to a
Okay.
British pronunciation better because of the clipped nature.
Irrevocably. Were his sworn enemies aware that the Force had shifted irrevocably?
See,
It
it
worked. Look,
works.
it worked. I got it. It worked. Yeah. That should be the opening of the.
That will be the opening now, don't worry.
Yeah.
Oh no. I love it.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome back to Fanalysis Star Wars. I'm Callan, this is Matt,
Hello, welcome.
and this is Evan.
Hello, everyone.
Today, Matt, we are talking about...
We're talking about The Tenebrous Way, which is a short story written by Matthew Stover that was released in Star Wars Insider number 130 in December of 2011, which, as we just spoke about a minute ago off camera, meant that you could have actually read this before reading the Plagueis novel, which I don't think it would have made any sense. You know, I think you need the
You
context
would
for
have
that
Not
been
book.
quite,
really
no.
confused, I feel.
Yeah. But we here have never hid the fact that we love Matthew Stover, all things Matthew Stover. He's one of the better Star Wars authors, one of the best, I should say, rather, along with the likes of James Luceno and a select few others that I'm sure we'll talk about more in depth someday. So this is something that I've been wanting to look at for a little while now, but because it's a short story, I think our format is going to be a little bit different than normal. We can't really make sense of this without also talking about the events of what happens in the Plagueis book. And we're also going to try to couch the discussion in sort of a little bit of a look at the character that is Tenebrous as, he relates to both his apprentice and the Sith immediately prior to him. So those would be the Sith of the Bay Knight line. I say that we don't actually know too many about like his master and like the Sith right ahead of him in the line. It's more just talking about the sort of Sith dynasty, if you want to look at it that way, that he was heir to and what he ended up leaving behind. And also he didn't actually ever want to have an heir, actually, as seems to be a common thread for many of the Sith in this order.
Yeah.
But in any event, do you guys want to talk about any of your opening thoughts about Hunibus as a character before we start looking at the literature?
I think this story not only does like a really good job of like just introducing you to just like the base aspects of Tenebrous's character that we get in the book, but to your point earlier about like the rule of two dynasty at this specific point in history, I think what this work really highlights, and this is also something that's obviously a big point in the book itself, how the Bay Knight line has really changed, particularly in the past few generations, kind of like post Darth Gravid onward. That
Mhm.
seems to be kind of the point in the line where there's this massive sort of, I wouldn't even say massive, but it's a pretty significant divergence in the approach to not only general Sith philosophy, but also just the mechanics of what they were essentially trying to accomplish, because when you look at Tenebrous in particular, like in this story very speaks to the fact that like they had to shift their focus, not only obviously due to the loss of so much of the original history, but also the changes of the galaxy and sort of this revelation. It's like, no, if we want to exceed, we have to approach things more covertly, more scientifically, more politically, in that sense. And I think this is just an excellent encapsulation of that change in mindset. But at the same time, I think what I also like about this is it also demonstrates for as much as Tenebrous is ahead of the curve, he's also embodying a lot of the traits that kind of led to the original Sith's downfall in the first place, I would say. So it's a nice little juxtaposition of that in the sense of like, for everything he does that you could is right, he also does a lot wrong, especially in this story as we're about to get to. So I really like that because it sort of highlights this very interesting time in Sith history overall.
Well said. Well said.
For me, I haven't got too much to say about his character. It's more about how it's been expressed in the literary works we've seen him as. As we mentioned before the recording, he's interesting as a character in the fact that everything we know about him is post death, including this entire short, as we'll cover shortly. It's impressive how much character you get across from him and how much information on the plot side of his character as well that is expressed in such a short space of time. I mean, we know a lot about Tenebrous, particularly compared to the average
Yes.
Bay Knight Sith.
Yeah.
And I mean, how we've had 5 minutes of material in world material covered by him in the present. So it's depending on how you count that again, as we'll cover in a second. So yeah, it's impressive how much we know about him, how much not just content, but like sense of a character and a being we get through this very short page space. So yeah, that's
Yes.
always been what struck me the most interesting about him, outside of the lore material, which we'll cover in a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's impressive use of
Really,
a short as a medium, I think, for a
yeah,
character like this.
Yeah. Yeah,
really,
absolutely.
yeah, really speaks to the strength of also Matthew Stover's particular writing style, because he's always had a talent in saying a lot in a little. Not that James Luceno can't do that too; he very much can. But when it comes to characterization, I always feel like his ability to, I guess, express a character's particular way of speaking and their thought process in the words is always something he's really done well on. And again, for someone like Tenebrous, who, to your point, Callan, that we know relatively so little about at this point, the fact that he's able to take what little elements we see in the actual Plagueis novel and expand them into the way that he does in this, even though, again, it's not a massive expansion. Like, this entire little thing is only like about 5 pages. So the fact that he's able to squeeze so much character into just such a small package is really impressive, and it definitely just further highlights why he is such a talented writer.
Just on
Yeah.
that point as well, it's also worth noting, alongside that, I should have mentioned, he does a lot of work to bolster our understanding and perspective of Plagueis as well. Like, it's even in such a short page space, he's not just covering and encapsulating everything we need to know about Tenebrous, but also bolstering what will then be learned chronologically in terms of release, but usually retroactively in terms of having read it, the Plagueis character. So yeah, it's a very, very fine example of how to make a short accompanying a short work for another's book.
We're going to be talking about, some of the passages of both stories a little bit more in depth later, but just to piggyback a little bit off of or dovetail off of what you just said a little bit earlier, Evan, about the differences between them as authors, and especially because we're going to be looking at so much of Lucino's work in general, um, with in other episodes with other books, because of the next big book that we're looking at the point of this recording, I think is going to be Dark Lord: Rise of Darth Vader, which is also written by James Lucino. Um, the two authors, I think, are in some ways more similar than any other two authors I can think of that work in the Star Wars mythos. I think they have slightly crisscrossed strengths. I don't really consider Stover as having weaknesses, to be honest. And I don't think that James Lucino has many weaknesses either, but you can kind of tell. One thing I've been working through kind of in the background as we look at other stories, both in Star Wars and out in other franchises. I've been going through his Millennium Falcon book, and his use of the language. He knows how to write kind of like a low to the ground, sort of dirty grunt of a character, but you can tell in his heart he really wants all of his characters to be Darth Plagueis. Plagueis
Yeah,
is like tailor made for Lucino's
you really can feel that
writing
from his
style.
works.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that Lucino is pretty far and away the best world builder working in. Although having said that, Timothy Zahn, having been through his
Mm.
stuff recently, was really good.
As we
But
talked about
Lucino's
before that
heart
recording.
really, yeah, Lucino's heart has always been more in the pure world building side of things. And I always thought that Matthew Stover better understands hearts and minds. Like he's just very, very good at writing character. I mean, they both have elegant prose and like, a great depth of thought and thoughtfulness and creativity in the way that they approach their stories. But I don't want to say that one author is better than the other. But yeah, I really love that Lucino was able to tell the Darth Plagueis story because it's a perfect character study that's it's perfectly tailored for his particular style of prose and dialogue,
Mm.
and sort of a insular kind of thought. One of my internal monologue. That's what I was trying
Yeah,
to say there.
it was definitely the right man
Very,
to
very
give the
good.
character to. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It played to both
It,
yeah.
the strength of the material and his own strengths as a writer perfectly.
Hmm.
and it's especially impressive when you consider at the time, how relatively little he had to work with in terms of, I mean, he essentially created Plagueis's
Mm.
characterization, all on his own. Like, the amount of material that came, before that is very, very basic. So the fact that he was able to construct so much, but also do it in a way that actually fills in so nicely is, again, it just shows the, depth of his abilities as to construct a world that slots in so well with what was established.
Hmm. So, to ground this into discussion of the two characters, I'm going to read a little passage from Chapter 5, Homecoming, from the Darth Plagueis novel. This is Plagueis in his laboratory on Abora, which is like his private island fortress,
Syndrome's there.
Syndrome's lair, exactly, which is called No Man is an Island, or No Man is an Island, which is one of my favorite bad puns. Um, but anyway, best Pixar, one of the best Pixar movies anyway. But anyway, so yeah, he has this is I don't know, like maybe a week and a half, few days, something like that, after he's killed his master, Darth Tenebrous, and he has withdrawn a vial of his own blood to subject it to analysis in his laboratory. And this is a smattering of his thoughts on that. So it says, while midichlorians appeared to resist manipulation of a sort that might imperil the balance of the force, they remained passive, even compliant, in the case of a weak-willed being manipulated by one who was strong in the force. Perhaps that explained why it was often easier to call on the force to heal someone other than oneself. Extending life, then, could hinge on something as simple as being able to induce midichlorians to create new cells, to subdivide at will, increasing their numbers into the tens of thousands, to heal or replace damaged, aging, or metastatic cells. Midichlorians had to be compelled to serve the needs of the body, to bestow strength when needed, or to overcome physical insult, or prevent cells from reaching senescence. Um, that is pretty much a guiding light that kind of links the two characters because although it becomes quite clear that they didn't work in concert on this topic very well throughout their careers as Sith, this was very much this was dominant at the forefront of both of their thought processes over the course of many generations or rather many decades over a century in the case of Tenebrous because I also before him I have to confess I never thought of the Bith as being a particularly long-lived race. I don't know if we're ever told how long they typically live,
Yeah,
but
Yeah,
something
clearly
it
about
doesn't
the nature
really.
of their abilities makes them you think of short-lived species, like similar to
like
the
Solarians.
Exactly, Solarian, yeah, exactly that from Mass Effect. The idea that they have all of these natural advantages that you think that they it gives the impression of compressed time to that's why they need those.
Mhm.
But yeah, they are pretty long-lived by the looks.
It's Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know if there's ever like a direct answer as to their actual span, or if for whatever reason, like Tenebrous was in some way, abnormal. In fact, the way he kind of muses about Biths in this story, it's
Mhm.
almost implied that he was like the only Bith Sith Lord, which is kind of
Yeah,
interesting
it is
Mm.
because
directly implied. He says that he's the
yeah,
only Sith to have a Bith mindset or the capabilities of thinking about things in the way that a Bith would. So he
yeah.
was the only Bith, yes.
Mm.
Yeah, and like I remember when I was rereading that, and I was even kind of racking my brain trying to think of any other Bith like Sith like that predated him, and I can't really think of any off the top of my head. None that really
No,
stick out.
no.
Which is interesting because it also kind of gives the writing a good way of like approaching this, like how would a Bith think about this? How would a Bith's view of the Force manifest? And we get a lot of that with Plagueis, obviously, too, him being a Mun, which is covered in the book itself. But
Mhm.
I like how they sort of weave that into this story, because it's like, yes, if you're part of a species where intellect is kind of the main crux of like what makes you extraordinary, well, of course someone with a powerful connection to the Force like Tenebrous would use that, to his best advantage. That's how his strength in the Force would manifest. But at the same time, I also like how that sets up his ultimate downfall, because it shows how, even though he is sort of making best use of his native strengths, taking that too far without thinking about everything else is what can also land you in big trouble, which obviously it does. So again, I like that sort of dynamic and balance. Again, that's why it just makes this such a great companion piece to the Plagueis novel.
Mm.
Yeah, Tenebrous is sort of a strange mix of a lot of different things. In some senses, he feels much like he is cut from the exact same cloth as his apprentice, or both of his apprentices. That's another funny thing is there he makes no mention of Venemus in the Tenebrous
Mm.
Way.
At
Up to
all.
the point
Which
if
is odd.
I wonder whether Stover knew about that character when he wrote it. But the uh, in some ways he seems like that he's just like Plagueis in the sense that he has a public persona. He's Regis Gnome. He's a famous, renowned starship engineer, designer, businessman, magnate, mobile kind of a person, right? Um, so he can hide in plain sight, or hide in plain sight. He can operate the exact same way that the Sith of this time period do, but he seems to have like a real regard for like the Sith of the ancient time in a way that, or at least Plagueis is under that impression. When you read the Tenebrous Way, he seems Tenebrous seems quite as dismissive of prior generations as Plagueis does in some
Yeah, that was
sense,
one of
but
the
that's
most
not how
interesting things
he.
about it to me. The fact that he dismisses,
Yeah.
I mean, he ridicules the rule of two, and
Mm.
for being
Mhm.
ludicrous. That's
Well,
something that you would
I'll
never
talk about
expect
that.
from that.
Yeah,
Yeah, coming from
Yeah,
Plagueis.
it's kind of
we'll talk about that later. Like, let's save that for like toward the end of it because we can
Mm,
wrap that's kind of his thoughts coalesce around
yeah.
where that line of thought will terminate. It is, I agree though. For now, it is very interesting that he does do that because in the Plagueis novel, um, Plagueis at one point directly calls Tenebrous a Bane adoring Sith. Bane
Yeah,
adoring Sith
exactly.
like Tenebrous,
Mhm.
might have thought this way, but I don't think so. And so it's really funny because you get the sense that every Sith is sort of like a thespian giving like a permanent performance to their apprentice. Like I'm never actually telling you what I
And vice
really think,
versa as
but
well.
and vice versa, yes. Um, but it's they never seem to consider the other ones doing that. Like Plagueis never
Very
thinks,
fitting.
oh, Tenebrous must have had all these secrets. He never does that. And likewise, Tenebrous, until it's too late, never credits Plagueis with any higher thought or hidden,
Mhm.
potential or meaning. But so I read the bit about the midichlorians because that directly is dealing with a lot of the meat of the Tenebrous Way. But before we get into that, there's other mentions. What Plagueis is thinking about the dark side because his whole goal. I'm sure that you know this, viewer, but if you don't, if you somehow wound up here very, very randomly, to put it simply, Plagueis wants to live forever. He's sort of the Star Wars answer to Voldemort from Harry Potter. Like he does not want to die. Um, and Tenebrous believes that he has inculcated perfectly and persistently and purposefully that fear of death into making Plagueis the perfect instrument through which he wishes to funnel his own plans for immortality. But we'll touch at that later. So they talk about other prior dark side masters. So after the comment about how to manipulate the midichlorians and compelling them into doing things like I just outlined a little bit ago. Legis then says, if one accepted the tales handed down in accounts and holocrons, the ancient Sith had known how to accomplish this. But had Sith like Nagasado and Exar Kun genuinely been more powerful, or had they benefited from the fact that the dark side had been more prominent in those bygone eras? I like that because it's like it couldn't possibly be more powerful than I am. They had to have something else
Yeah,
going on.
exactly. Yeah.
There's got to be something, some reason, right?
Yeah.
And so then it
Um,
says,
Oh,
go
can I
ahead,
just say
go ahead, go ahead. Yes.
one little thing in relation to that? I also like the juxtaposition too because Exar Kun and Naga Sadow in particular were Sith who very much specialized in things like sorcery and whatnot, and then it's later brought up in the Plagueis novel that like that was an area of dark side study that both Plagueis and Tenebrous himself
Mhm.
kind of weren't it wasn't really something that it was a talent that they kind of lacked in comparison. So
Well,
I kind of like how that kind of ties that together too, because it's not only are they talking about a different age, but they're also talking about Sith who specialized in dark side arts that they themselves are kind of more disconnected from. So that
It,
that level of
it's in
understanding is further limited by that.
it's in this very passage because he goes on to say some commentators claimed that the ability to survive death had been limited to those with a talent for sorcery and alchemy, and that the use of such practices actually predated the arrival of the Dark Jedi exiles on Korriban. So that is like talking about when what was that one called? Was that called the Great Hyperspace War?
yeah.
Or was that
Yeah,
yeah. So, that you're dipping back into like thousands and thousands of years ago at that point. And that was after a schism within the Jedi Order led the dark side disciples, they weren't calling themselves Sith at that point, to exile
exile.
themselves. Yeah.
Yeah,
And they wound up encountering the Sith race on Korriban. And I suppose a host of
Ajun,
other worlds too.
Ajunta Paul, who we meet in
Hmm.
KOTOR,
Ajunta
obviously.
Paul, yeah.
Yeah,
And so that's when you have this sort of melding of the Dark Jedi sort of philosophy and name and like knowledge of the Jedi, with the sort of the Sith name and like their years of like ancestral heritage and philosophy, and you kind of have a kind of like it's an interesting time because you do have that's the reason why you get terms like Sith pureblood because you started having these blending of like humans with the Sith
Yeah.
species, and you would have people who had different percentages of Sith blood, and that was a big deal for a long time
Dice
in that
Cal,
society.
Hero Cal,
Mhm.
Mark Aragnos, all those guys, direct
Yeah,
descendants.
Hmm.
yeah, but
It's also
I
interesting that
guess.
they've referred
All right,
to
go
the
ahead.
sorcery that way as well, because obviously that's something that gets cast straight back down to Bane in his originality. He was
Hmm.
always very impressed by sorcery as a power. Something else that they that kind of
Again, yeah.
is lost in
Yeah,
the
this is all.
in the
Yeah.
dynasty basically. And I also like
Yeah.
the mistakes or the conclusions that these two are drawing. I mean, obviously it plays on that human aspect where most Sith, even if they're not human, most Sith will have that personality trait of the narcissism and the egocentricity. Um, but you'd expect that to be the least the case in characters like Tenebrous and Plagueis, the Bith and the Mune. But instead, it's the exact opposite. It's taken even further because the expectation that they're above such problems is what makes them so vulnerable to it. And I like that that's played with both on the personality and character level, but also in how they both each meet their demises, and also
Hmm.
how both of their force deficiencies manifest. I think it's a really
Right.
clever kind of choice for the characters, tying it back into their
Yeah,
system.
Plagueis sort of. I won't say dismisses sorcery, but he discounts it a bit in the sense that he has convinced himself it's not what he needs because he
Mm.
says sorcery had been employed less to extend life than to create illusions, fashion beasts, and resurrect the dead. Powerful adepts were said to have been able to saturate the atmosphere of planets with dark side energy, compel stars to explode, or induce paralysis in crowds, as Exarchun apparently did to select members of the Republic Senate. Other adepts used sorcery merely as a means to better understand ancient Sith spells and sigils. Darth Bane had referred to sorcery as one of the purest expressions of the dark side of the Force, and yet he hadn't been able to harness those energies with near the skill as had his one-time apprentice, Zana. So it's very much and you'll notice he uses the term powerful adepts were said to have been able to.
Mm.
And that's because
Mm.
of the time period that you already mentioned, Evan, the Gravid mastery, which he refers to as the brief mastery of Darth Gravid. And we're never told exactly how brief that means. But I mean, you think you think about like Bane was like Xana's master for what, 20 years, something like that. Brief, I think, would then probably hinge on maybe like 5 or 6 years, like less than a decade, I
Max,
would
yeah.
think, you know?
Three,
Yeah.
three
Yeah,
to five would be
it's
So
my
kind of.
instinct.
But we know he also trained was enough to train his own apprentice too. So it's
yeah, but you get the sense that her training was far from complete when
yeah.
we're told he was inexplicably drawn to the light side. And I have this strong impression that Lucino was trying to tee up a story that he never got to tell with that. I think that was
Mm.
a whole
Yeah,
book he wanted to tell that was never just in the cards after a while because
It,
the
it would have
canon
been
kind of
awesome.
it's one of the
shifted.
biggest single concepts within Star Wars that hasn't been played with as well. The idea of the Sith
Yeah.
returning to the light. That isn't Revan's story, obviously, whereas there's a lot of messiness to
Yeah,
that
that's
sets it
different.
up.
Yeah,
Very
yeah,
rare
that's a
though.
whole
Just on a
different. Yeah,
pure character choice
yeah.
level, it's very difficult and therefore interesting to imagine the idea of a Sith as an actual Sith, not just a dark sider, but an actual
Mhm.
Sith turning to the light.
Yeah,
Yeah,
That's
which is
pretty much
and
actually
an impossibility
yeah.
in the way they are. So that would
Yeah.
be a really fascinating story, I think.
One thing I do give SWTOR credit for is they actually do kind of play with that in one of the missions. No,
Mm.
I don't remember who it was, but like one of the council masters actually managed to convince a member of the Dark Council to actually, um, come back to the light. I don't remember the names of any of the characters involved, but I do remember that being a thing in one of the missions, and it's like it's a very again I give him credit for playing with that because that you're right, that is something that very rarely gets touched upon. Like I said, outside of Rev, and I mean Darth Vader, obviously, but that has its own.
Yeah, but
That
again,
has its
they're
own
well,
not
area.
turning back to they're not being
Yeah,
drawn to the light. They're just being drawn away from the dark. There's a difference.
yeah,
Like Darth Vader
yeah,
never gets a
yeah,
yeah.
true redemption, and Revan had his mind wiped, so it's not as clear. Like step away from the Sith
Revan's a
philosophy.
whole different
It's a
story.
whole mess.
Yeah,
But you need
right.
that. It would be a fascinating story to have someone that immersed in the pure concept of evil as their way of being to then go.
yeah,
I'm going to be something else now. That's
yeah.
something that'd be
Hmm.
very, very, very difficult to pull off compellingly. I think
But
it's a missed
he,
opportunity to not have that story.
Absolutely.
More than any other legend story,
well,
if there was one more like now made legend story, I'd want to see that by Lucino.
yeah, that would be great. And
I
and I
would be
get the
all.
idea. I get the idea that, and we'll discuss that a little bit more in depth because we don't know much, but we know more than nothing. But it'll be on a later chapter deep
Hmm.
dive, guys. Because Plagueis only really tells that story pretty deep into Palpatine's apprenticeship. So what little we know comes from that chapter. So we'll look at that
Hmm.
another time. But
Hmm.
the reason I highlighted it though is because you had mentioned, Evan, that you get the sense that there's like an awful lot of lost sort of knowledge and also a change in the like a real like
Change of perspective.
a real like I think a gravitic shift, you know, is probably is something Lucino actually says a couple of times. And maybe that's the reason why Gravid has the name that he does. But that's kind of the genesis point of like what the Sith that we now recognize as like totally obscure. They behave more in their actual persona as whatever their professional capacities are. Their
Hmm.
professional public lives. They're more impactful there than they are as like
Yeah.
Sith masters in the
There's
dark anymore.
Yeah. One of
And
those that actually kind of sticks in my head is actually Vectivus, who's obviously pretty prominent in the first few Legacy of the Force books as being the example Lumaya brings up of a quote unquote, good Sith who lived a full life and just kind of did things to not only better himself but better the people around him. And while certain things are implied like, oh, is this actually true? Is this element true? So on and so forth. I like how it teased that kind of up too, because it's just another example of that mindset, even taken further, depending on the timeline.
yeah, so jumping off the back of his comments about sorcery and Zana, um, like it says that Bane's disciples, however, believed that he had experimented with a technique of even greater significance, that of essence transfer, which he had learned after acquiring and plundering the holocron of Darth Andedu. Worst dark side, most obvious name, Darth Undead. But anyway, and in which involved the relocation of an individual's consciousness into another body, or in some cases a talisman, temple, or sarcophagus. Thus had the most powerful of the ancient Sith lords survived death to haunt and harass those who would infiltrate their tombs. None of this amounted to corporeal survival. And that's the reason why some of this stuff Plagueis can only guess as like it's a little more than folklore among the Sith. He doesn't know for sure that any of this happened because Gravid destroyed so many of the records before his apprentice killed him and saved what she could. Um, he also, as a Sith, as immune, as just a walking ego, has little interest in entertaining the idea that people before him had access to powers that he does not. So he's more inclined to think, the dark side itself was stronger back then. That's how they did all that. Or, I don't know how to do these things. These techniques were lost, but they're not really what I want anyway. I want this over here. So, and the reason why that's so good is when you're reading the Tenebrous Way, Tenebris thinks the exact same way, pretty much, and at the same time, very clearly guarded all of his thoughts and processes and sort of techniques and everything, all of his true ideas from his apprentice. It's just a really fun thing. But yeah, Plagueis has no interest in being a lingering disembodied presence trapped between worlds and powerless to affect the material realm, except through the actions of weak-minded beings he could goad, coax, or will into action. What he really wants is everlasting life. And so it's really great because that passage also, that bespeaks a lot about what we're about to talk about with Tenebris.
Mhm.
The other thing as well, going back to that kind of Bainite perspective that's kind of lost here, is that be it through ego, be it through scientific misunderstanding, whatever it happens to be, from Plagueis and Tenebrous, they both seem to be operating on the false assumption that the dark side, or maybe it's not false, maybe it is just literally a philosophical perspective, I guess, but the assumption that the dark side is weaker for them than it was in the past. There was an era of greatness in the past that allowed some of these previous practitioners to tap into greater or more esoteric powers. But that obviously is completely counter to what Bane was perceiving and setting up with the rule of two, because the whole point was that back in his day, in his perspective anyway, the dark side had been diluted amongst too many drawers of the dark side, and that bringing things down to the rule of two would mean that it would only be one master and one inheritor.
I
Basically
think,
leading us to that kind of all of them had it, Tenebrous and Plagueis here as well. That moment when they assume the mantle of the Dark Lord and feel, oh my God, the power, the dark side is flowing through me. That they all have
yeah,
that. So It's funny
Yeah,
how even despite having experienced that, they still then go on to have that egomaniac response of,
Yeah.
"Oh, if only I lived back in the previous era, then all these powers would be available to me." You know?
That also harkens back to the beginning of the book where Plagueis notes that Bane had been like deified by that point
yeah,
in history,
Mm.
which you definitely get the sense that that's probably like, I mean, I'm sure Bane obviously he wanted to be remembered as this like great savior, but you probably get the sense that how they viewed him might not have been entirely what he was kind of hoping for, and to an
yeah,
extent,
yeah.
I like
I don't think
deified
he.
definitely seems like a
I
bit
don't think.
much.
I
Mm.
don't think Bane would give a shit to be remembered at all. I think he just wanted the Sith line to be what he thought it was supposed to be, and like ironically, it has the effect you're talking about because everybody else is kind of blinkered by this sort of limited vision. Because what you were talking about, Callan, if you jump back to the beginning of the book, the very beginning of the book is a prologue from Sidious's perspective, and this is in the direct, aftermath of having killed his master in his sleep, as
And
we were told happened
descended.
in the Opera House. Yes, he's ascended. Yeah. So, and it's this funny thing, and I'll read this passage, and then we'll talk about what you just mentioned there. Confident that the will of the dark side had been done, he returned to the suite's window wall. Two beings in a galaxy of countless trillions, but what had transpired in the suite would affect the lives of all of them. Already the galaxy had been shaped by the birth of the one, and henceforth would be reshaped by the death of the other. But had the change been felt and recognized elsewhere, were his sworn enemies aware that the force had been shifted irrevocably? Can't say that word.
Irrevocably. Irrevocably.
Irrevocably. Can you guys say that
Irrevocably.
word better than I can?
Irrevocably.
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 I think it lends itself to a
Okay.
British pronunciation better because of the clipped nature.
Irrevocably. Were his sworn enemies aware that the force had shifted irrevocably?
See,
It
it
worked. Look,
works.
it worked. I got it. It worked. Yeah. That should be the opening of the.
That will be the opening now. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Oh no. I love it.
But had the change been felt and recognized elsewhere, were his sworn enemies aware that the force had shifted irrevocably? Would it be enough to rouse them from self righteousness? He hoped not, for now the work of vengeance could begin in earnest. So that's sort of Sidious, like, kind of wondering. And it's like, it's that thing you were talking about. There's this moment of feeling like all powerful, getting caught up in the wake of I've just killed my master, but there's sort of a foot in both realms of one of I've never felt more powerful ever, but also this other foot in doubt and speculation. Because then it says his eyes sought and found an ascending constellation of stars, one of power and consequence new to the sky, though soon to be overwhelmed by dawn's first light. Low in the sky, over the flatlands, visible only to those who knew where and how to look, it ushered in a bold future. To some, the stars and planets might seem to be moving as ever, destined to align in configurations calculated long before their fiery births. But in fact, the heavens had been perturbed, tugged by dark matter into novel alignments. In his mouth, Sidious tasted the tang of blood. In his chest, he felt the monster rising, emerging from shadowy depths and contorting his aspect into something fearsome, just short of revealing itself to the world. The dark side had made him its property, and now he made the dark side his. Breathless, not from exertion, but from the sudden inspiration of power, he let go of the sill and allowed the monster to writhe through his body like an unbroken beast of range or prairie. Had the force ever been so strong in anyone? Sidious had Sidious had never learned how Plagueis' own master had met his end. Had he died at Plagueis' hand? Had Plagueis, too, experienced a similar exultation on becoming a sole Sith Lord? Had the beast of the end time risen then to peek at the world it was to inhabit, knowing its release was imminent? His, he raised his gaze to the ecliptic. The answers were out there, coated in light, speeding through space and time, liquid fire coursing through him, visions of the past and future riffling through his mind. He opened himself to the reconfigured galaxy as if in an effort to peel away the decades. And that's kind of how you're seeing, like, teeing up
Mm.
the events of Baldemnik. But everything there, aside from just how beautiful the language is, despite my butchered pronunciation of everything, everything you're seeing there is what you've been talking about. I am the shit. I am God now. I am basking in my own dark glory and power. And I'm also wondering about like, and so when you have that feeling, when you have that power at hand, and you also think about the things you haven't learned and don't know and don't quite feel ready for, and then you read the history of, well, this Sith Lord blew up stars, and that one lived forever until he didn't. And then this one happened, and Darth Zana
And this one
says,
ate
she claims,
worlds.
she claims she infiltrated the Jedi Temple. I doubt it, but whatever. Like things we know happened. You have that sense of, well, okay, I've got all this. How come I can't do that? They did this. Something's wrong. Like something's
Mm.
got to be missing. Like something's missing from the record, or something's not right about the world, or I haven't unlocked this yet. It's that perfect blend of ego, and that's kind of where you get everything you were talking about was Bane's theory, and I can't remember whether he said this in the novel or whether it's from like the Book of the Sith, but it's like the Force being concentrated as venom, like in one vial
Mm.
or vessel, and that sort of contrasts with I think Luke describing it more like fire, like a light that spreads.
Mm.
And so it's very much like I don't know if Bane is wrong or right. I think certainly his reading of it is as valid as anybody else's, kind of a thing. But Bane also was a step apart from the other Sith in that he honestly believed in the cycle. He
Yeah.
saw and if you look at his first book, the idea really comes from him studying Revan's holocron. He already had this
Mm.
idea that something was wrong with the Sith Order as it existed at the time that he came about. But Revan in his musings, he didn't necessarily come up with a rule of two because he presided over a Sith empire. He wasn't trying to say there could only ever be two. But what he did say was any master who trains more than one apprentice is setting themselves up for failure. The other apprentices will band together and take you out.
Mm.
And that's kind of the spark around which Bane's theory really became coalesced. But
The way
so that's
I've
where you
always
get
looked
that
at it
that
is
idea.
Luke is more accurate and correct holistically, but
Mhm.
Bane isn't wrong in the fact that the type of Sith that he is, his truth is the truth because he's the kind of person who it manifests around his own being. If more Sith had been like Bane, it would be true for their eras as well. But because they just didn't manifest the dark side and the Force around themselves quite the same way, they didn't kind of stranglehold it into their being. It didn't have that same issue of the dilution effect of the era.
Yeah.
That's why I've always looked at it, and I think that Luke's is more broadly true of the whole history of the galaxy. It's that kind of spark of the flame that either burns
Well,
intensely
it's
hot in one
certainly
location or it spreads wide like an inferno.
Well, it's certainly true from the perspective of a Jedi. I don't see how a
Mm.
Jedi could look at it as venom or think that it only matters if, like, there can only be one Yoda, and the more Yodas there are,
Yeah,
the
but the
the
dark
weaker
side
the Jedi are
specifically, they
for
could
it.
look at it like that. They
The
could look
dark
at the
side,
dark element
yes,
of the Force
Right.
rather than the
yeah,
Force broadly, because the light clearly operates in different on a different
yeah.
metric. There
They're
is no
they're
dilution
different
effect
natures,
there.
but
Coincides with
Mm.
yeah,
different
yeah.
philosophies and the different
That's
natures
why
of the powers that they're drawing
that's why I
from.
wouldn't that's why I wouldn't say that Bane was correct, and because the way that they say it is the Force is this, the Force is venom, or
Yeah,
the Force is fire. It can be both. It's like they're divergent natures.
yeah.
Playing with the same mystical element, really. But yeah. So that all of that though, with Sidious, casting his vision towards the heavens and peeling back the decades, trying to see what happened with Plagueis's master.
Mhm.
That's kind of that's the stage upon which the Tenebrous Way unfolds. So we can start talking about that. We kind of are talking about the substance of the thing last because it is the story is about an ongoing eternal moment of death, an eternal demise kind of a thing, and the
Yeah,
unfolding of that.
because
So
because the entire story is basically first person perspective of basically Tenebris's, well, essence, for lack of a better term, because it starts with him
consciousness,
being,
his mind,
yeah,
yes, yeah.
whatever
Mhm.
whatever whatever you want to call it. There's multiple different interpretations of him basically expiring on Baldemnik, as we see
Why
happen
don't
in the
we why don't we talk about what he's done? Because
yeah.
just to give us the language with which to express this, he has not used essence transfer, which was something that Plagueis was musing about during the Banite era. He has engineered a retrovirus that he used to alter the nature of a certain number of his midichlorians into being something that he somewhat laughingly referred to as maxichlorians,
To
which
make
are
them a kind of
things,
contagion.
Interesting name, yeah.
yeah, which is to prevent them. And it's funny because you get we're told it's kind of like the Revan Bane thing. like a germ of an idea became something else.
Mm.
He discounted Plagueis's musings about midichlorians and everything throughout the entirety of their apprenticeship, of their mentorship, the relationship. And at the same time, something Plagueis said at some point triggered that thought of, oh, well, maybe he's not completely wasting my time. Maybe he's onto something with this. And so, because he does say that of all known beings, Plagueis always had an unrivaled ability to manipulate the midichlorians. It wasn't something that Tenebrous stood on even ground with him, even as the master. It's sort of like Bane being unable to instruct Zana in the arts of sorcery, but at the
But at
same
the same
time,
time, that's okay
yeah,
because that was what he created
hmm
him for. It's like it's okay
yeah,
that he has that power because I'm the reason he has it, so it's fine.
yeah,
Yeah, he
yeah.
takes
Going back to that
he
ego
takes
thing.
that idea and and runs with it using what he can do to benefit himself. Again, very Sith.
Mm.
And we're told that he, from his perspective, he never really looked at Plagueis as being a true successor in the Bainite fashion. He didn't really want him to usurp the mantle. And that's the thing, you get the sense that none of these Sith, the further down the line you go, ever really do. Like, you never really feel like Sidious wants Vader to usurp the mantle someday. He wants a perfect, you know, servant, basically, somebody to carry out his business. You could say that the ideas there have been more muddled over the time because they've been around the longest, and sometimes you get the sense it's more earnest than it is. The
Mm.
characters as they stand now, I think quite clearly, Sidious didn't actually want to be usurped by anybody. But you get the same thing here. Um, Tenebrous doesn't really want Plagueis to be like his perfect apprentice. He wants to use him as a vessel through which he can survive the moment of physical death before he can get to that perfect being. Because what Tenebrous has done, and this is talking about the nature of the Bith, is he he used to have the ability, as most Force users do, to glimpse hints and portents, visions of the future. Being a Bith and being studied in their tradition of science, he specializes in what he refers to as future casting formulas. And so he is so confident as in his ability to predict the future using more mundane means. He doesn't put any stock into the idea that he needs to use the Force to tell what the future will be. And he takes from his readings, and maybe Evan, you can explain to me what the Journal of the Wills is. That comes to,
Even
that's
well,
something that
even the lore itself is sometimes a little inconsistent on what
I
exactly
I'd
that
like
is.
you I'd like I'm going to tee you up for an explanation real quick. But he takes from that the key grain of an idea there is that he understands based on that what the Jedi call the chosen one. He never uses that language, I don't think. But being of pure force
Hmm.
is coming, is inbound. And he can tell just using his future casting formulas, he's not quite going to make it. He's going to die a little bit before, like in cosmic time, he's right there. But it's still a few decades distant. He's just on the cusp of being there for the birth of that being. So he wants to use Plagueis as like basically a walking petri dish for him to filter his consciousness through so that he can position himself in time to usurp the body of this perfect force being.
Right.
And he gets that notion from the Journal of the Wills, which, if you please take it away, Evan, and explain to everybody what that is, or what it isn't, or what it might
Yeah,
be.
I'll try. I'll try my best because even the lore itself is a little inconsistent on what exactly that is. Essentially,
Mhm.
what it essentially comes down to is like the Order of the Wills was basically this sect of incredibly knowledgeable Force users, and the original prophecy of the Chosen One kind of goes back to some of the prophecies that they originally wrote down. It's also the impetus. They're also the impetus for how Qui-Gon. We never get the story actually told, but allegedly their writings is also what led Qui-Gon to ultimately discover how to, well, rediscover, I should say, how to become a Force ghost. So that's kind of he uses that knowledge to. Tenebrous essentially does similar because he takes what the vague writings of what is essentially the Chosen One prophecy, combines it with just pure mathematical skill and dark side perception as a way to like, okay, in theory, the darkness will come at this point, and this forceful being will allegedly be born Therefore, I will take this time to set up my plan to eventually become that. He also makes a lot of, we'll get to it too, but he also makes references to a lot of other prophecies and future events that will eventually unfold. I mean, he even makes reference to the one Sith. He completely misses what that actually means, but
Mm.
he essentially
Yes.
uses that as like oh, I will be the one Sith because once I become the quote unquote chosen one, I will live forever. I will rule forever. There will be no need for any more Sith because I will be in control of everything. That's his musings.
He So one of my favorite passages, and it just the way that he thinks and like the arrogance on display. It's not even the most self-aggrandizing thing he thinks. He is quite, it's not quite a chip on his shoulder, does Darth Tenebrous. But one of my favorite bits that kind of encapsulates it is the future was always in motion, and while other Sith struggled to foresee the faintest, least specific hints of what was to come, Tenebrous had no need to see the future. He could calculate it. So like that's the gamble, right? It's after a
Mhm.
certain point and I think what you're talking about, so yeah, let's unpack that. He says he doesn't use the language of chosen one, but this force-born being, and he does make reference to a shadow. And the
Mhm.
shadow, of course, ends up being Sidious, and like everybody can kind of tell that. But he sees this force-born being and the shadow kind of converging around the same sort of focal points of destiny. So he can tell that I think he thinks it's one being. It turns out to be Anakin and Palpatine, and he can't necessarily completely blame him for making that mistake. And then he also, as you teed up there, he uh, mistakes the one Sith regime as being as having something to do with this, which it does not. Everybody who is aware of what the one Sith are will already know, but just to make it very plain, that's the Darth Krayt legacy era. And it's kind of funny because I feel that is though at the heart of what we're talking about, where these Sith that fall further away from Bane, they kind of want it to be all in one kind of a thing. Like this rule of two is absurd because you're sharing the power with another. It's less that they think Bane is wrong about the axioms around which he built it. Like they understand that. Like it is natural that the craving of power will eventually lead to a challenge for supremacy. What they discount, what Bane I think never really allowed himself to fully fall prey to is this delusion of there can only be one, right? That's at least possible. Like if two's good, one is better. That can be me. Like and and it's if I'm eternal and ongoing and never dying, undying, ceaseless, all
Mhm.
powerful. So he interprets those little portents as being all one and the same. Yeah.
Consolidating the venom down to its purest
hmm
singular form, like you said, because they're
And
essentially taking the aspect set up by the rule of two, but instead taking it to arguably its most logical extreme or illogical
yes,
extreme, depending on how you look at
yes.
it.
And so it's very vague on how he manages to achieve this, which is fine because it's all technobabble gobbledygook anyway. But what he ends up doing is he trains himself in such a way that his maxichlorians are able to filter his consciousness out of his dying vessel. Um, there was a price paid, and that was he sacrificed his ability to see the future. And he didn't mind because he could calculate it. I'm so good at this, I don't need that force ability. And that's what it doesn't explain how he manages to quarter off that being as the only horsepower that was affected. Um,
Mhm.
again, that's what I mean. It's gobbledygook, but
Mm.
it is kind of just hand wave that happened. So
Mhm.
he's operating purely with his own mathematical calculations and formulas. He does not know
He views it as
he
an acceptable loss because, like,
yes,
you're saying,
yeah,
it's not something he put much stock in to begin with. And I always kind of got the feeling that his ability to perceive the future, even from the get go, was always somewhat limited, which is probably also why he didn't, put too much stock into it. Even though, like, obviously his ability to predict is very well tuned, but again, that's all in the numbers. So I mean,
hmm
that's it's never stated. I don't want that to come off, but I feel like that could potentially have been also a possibility at some point.
The way
hmm
I was reading it is that he had one of the not necessarily the most powerful. He had an average foresight ability, but it was then enhanced to be one of the most powerful by his natural Bith biology. So that he was putting the two together to make the former one of the
Hmm.
greatest that we've ever seen. because just the detail he does get is way beyond anything we see from any other Foresight user. That isn't, one of those
Yeah,
cosmic moments.
the
But to
timing
your
of it.
point though, he doesn't even really like this is all theoretical to him until this happens. Like when he
Yeah, for sure.
attains
But
that higher
he's
level of
certain enough
consciousness.
about it that he's willing to sacrifice all these,
Yeah,
making all these risks, etc. So that's why I
yeah,
think, and the way it's just
and even
it's described
yeah.
before he actually goes through this experience. I
Right.
think it's
Because we know that
enough.
he's right about a lot of his predictions, obviously, because of the other lore and what
Yeah,
happens in
Yeah,
the future. But from his perspective, quite a bit of this is still theoretical
yeah,
and
for sure. It makes sense
isn't
that he
really
makes a
confirmed
sacrifice.
until
It's just
we.
from our perspective,
Yeah,
he
yeah,
shouldn't have done because what he didn't realize is he was way more accurate than he thought he might have
right.
been.
And
yeah,
even then,
the
he is wrong about various things as we already discussed
Yeah,
anyway. Even when he's at this level of consciousness, so I don't think it's too far off.
no, yeah.
no,
Depending.
I mean, it's a funny thing. It's all because of what ends up happening and how it happens. There's a dark irony to it, and there's a part of you that has to laugh at him for setting himself up this way. But at
Mm,
the same time, when you think about when he started making these predictions, um, it's pretty impressive what he does get right. All of these things do happen. It's just never in the way that he thinks, and it's as prone then to misinterpretation as foggy, hazy force visions. There's no
mm,
difference in terms of the accuracy at the end because and this was a detail I'd forgotten until I just reread it. In my head, you know how we recently went over Plagueis's origin story and how
mm,
he was basically a eugenics experiment between the mutants that like Tenebrous had come across. I, in my head, thought, yeah, okay, he did that deep into his apprenticeship. Really, right, like as a young Sith, he started putting those pieces in motion. He actually offs his master before even beginning that. So for
mm.
a while, he was the only Sith in existence.
That is how I
You
was
know,
interpreting myself personally. I didn't expect him to be doing that as a young Sith. Though I
I'll tell
guess
you
there's
why.
no
I think
reason it
I
couldn't
think
be
it
because
it,
of
I'll tell
everything he did
you.
with
I'll
it's
tell
Venge.
you
difficult
why.
because we don't get a good timeline for events. Like
Mm,
Yeah,
we don't even technically know his exact age or who his
no.
master was. So there's a lot of guesswork you kind of have to go with
mm,
that.
I'll tell you why I thought it was the other way around. A, because that's pretty uh, reckless, and he chastises Plagueis for his recklessness on Baldemnik. But it's a long plan. I mean, you're waiting for like he sets up the romance and the seductive, femme fatale aspect of Plagueis's mother with Pardamask, his father, years before a son ever is then born. And
mm.
then when the son is born, you have to wait for him for his force towns to prove and mature and everything else. So you're talking about decades of time going by. And then there's the fact that he had done this like we're told like a century ago is when he offs his master. So that means that he had probably a pretty average and the master was a Twi'lek who do not live far outlive. They're like humans. They have a normal lifespan, if you want to put it that way. So he had a normal sized or like a normal an average length apprenticeship, and then spent a significant amount of time as like a Dark Lord without an apprentice. Um, and then Plagueis himself is over 100 years old during the event when we're first meeting him.
Mm.
So he's I don't know. It seems like there's like quite
Yeah,
a big bit of
which I guess
overlap.
which I guess could imply that he's like potentially 200 plus,
It
depending.
could be. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
or at least knocking on the door of it. I think he's probably like. I don't think he could be less than 150, and probably a bit more than that. Um, but anyway, so it was just interesting to see that aspect of it unfold, and just how it's very clear. He's basically raising this person, Plagueis, and never really allowing him to see who he really is. These two really didn't know each other too well, despite being, you know, Sith apprentice, master and apprentice, like having that close, working relationship. For like Plagueis doesn't say exactly how long, but he says it's as often as like the average human might live. So 75, 85 years, something like that is, and in Star Wars, it's probably even 100. But it is very much like it's just impressive how it's impressive and foolish how they guarded their secrets for that long, and they were working really towards the same goal. And if they had just a little bit more of each other's knowledge, they might have been able to get something off the ground. And then at the same time, maybe not, because that was Plagueis's MO with Sidious. He was as open with him as any Sith Lord ever could be with their apprentice, and it
Mm.
was still like, nah, No, why should there be two when there can only be one?
Exactly.
Like I mean, that's the way that it works.
Because that was his
I,
breaking the line
yeah.
mentality. He wasn't looking for to follow the rule of two in the same way as was traditional, but he was still happy with two as long as it was a partnership and not a supplanting. Sidious was happy to have two as well as long as the second was always under his boot like Vader. But it's just funny how they all have their own little ideas of how the rule of two is supposed to work for them. It's the same thing with every Sith. You can't be Sith and not be selfish, and that selfishness manifests differently for every individual.
Yeah,
Exactly.
the other
It's a contradiction of the order juxtaposed to the philosophy and the nature of the dark side. And I
Mm.
also like too how this sort of kind of builds upon the fact that it was noted in the Plagueis book that Tenebrous and his master had spent years trying to create a virus that
which is
stripped
this clearly,
anti
yeah.
course, yeah. So
Yeah,
it's like you can
yeah.
clearly see, like, okay, not that didn't go the way that he thought, but it also, did bore fruit in this because he's essentially taking what worked about that and what works with Plagueis's midichlorian manipulations to try and create his own thing. That this doesn't work out either, but still, it's a nice building upon because
Well,
you also get the sense that like this is also like a multi like all of these generations had to contribute in their own ways in order to
yeah.
make these things happen.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the reasons why Plagueis has the wealth that he does is because of what's been hoarded over the years. One of the reasons why Plagueis knows as much is that even though Darth Gravid destroyed a good amount of the records, there's still like a hell of a lot, or it's still amassed, and 500 years since then of rebuilding. And he does come from, he was apprenticed to a master who knew what he was doing. In this, they use the word mundane a lot. They separate the worlds between like the mundane world and that of the higher mystical realm of the Force, and they have an equal ability to affect that. Maybe not quite so equal in the fact that Plagueis is like a perfectly positioned tool for that, and I credit Tenebrous a lot with setting that up. I mean, creating a Mune Fifth Lord and making it the son of somebody who was in charge of the banking clan for a time. I mean, that's a pretty
I mean, it's got to be the
well,
single
you know,
greatest or single most impactful decision in terms of the grand
yeah,
plan that any one
Right.
Sith of the line
yeah,
did, and it was the last link of
yeah,
the chain.
Mm.
Basically, aside from the fact that Tenebrous obviously had to be raised in the dark side as a Sith, if you could have it be that he was a start of the line, and they would have accomplished the
hmm
great grand plan just from that alone. You
Mhm.
didn't need
yeah.
anything
Well,
else
It's
except from the
true.
Sith history. Zana could have done this, and it would have made it would have brought the grand plan around 1,000 years previous. So, you know, he's definitely a weighty Sith, Tenebrous.
I also like at the same time though, I like how he brings up the difference in this sort of sequence between, Mun, thinking
Immune.
and Bith
Yeah.
thinking
Hmm.
because he even like kind of he disregards it in the sense of like seeing things as like transactional when in reality
Yeah.
it should all just be pure logic to its again like purest form. So I like that he at this while acknowledging the strengths of the Mune mindset, it's still to him because he's just so full of himself that
Well,
he had is
he's a
just this
Bith
being all around
he's a Bith
superior.
supremacist. It's pretty clear he's a Bith supremacist. He thinks
Oh
the
yeah,
Bith are the best,
absolutely.
the only game in town.
Yeah.
Everything that's great about him is because of his Bithness. I mean, he makes that quite
Yeah.
clear. Um,
And
and
again,
and
only Bith Sith Lord as far as we know, so that probably
yeah,
doesn't help that
and
situation either.
Plagueis is I wouldn't say that he lacked this entirely, and he thinks along the same lines, but he's more even-handed in how he gets there, and I don't think it's pretense because he tries to credit humans with the same sort of dignity that the reason they don't have it is it's their fault. If you're going to go around and scrounge with like the low of the galaxy and they treat you that way, that's your fault. When if you behaved like us, you would be just like us. He doesn't really see that much of an intrinsic difference between the
Mm.
potential of immune and a human. Um, Tenebris very much Bith supremacist. Like he thinks that he's the only game in town.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's he. The other added bit was he could tell based on his calculations and everything that Plagueis was going to be the one to usher in this force-born
Mhm.
being. So that's why, on top of needing to subvert his apprentice some way and use him as the vessel that would to survive physical death, so he could be there to usurp the chosen one's form, he also knew Plagueis was like an integral part of it. He was a key to the whole thing. You can't do any of this without Plagueis. So he didn't view Plagueis as like a complete waste of time. He just very much used him, or thought he was going to use him for a particular purpose.
Right.
And
Well,
and
because
that
that
was
comes
something
to
worth
head
noting.
Yeah. sorry, but that comes to a head when he enters Plagueis in particular, because he's able
Hmm.
to. It kind of has this. I like the difference in writing, because like before he actually, because we see the sequence. This is all like in sequence, so it
Hmm.
starts off with him leaving his physical body, and then goes to him slowly entering Plagueis. But then when he does enter him, I like how his perception of Plagueis immediately changes, because
Yeah.
he can actually see, he could feel the depth of his apprentice's not only power, but also his knowledge and his sort of ability to perceive things. And he even like straight up admits that like, oh, like his ability to like do this is beyond what even I, thought. Like he
I would
even says
challenge
straight
the
up,
word. I would challenge the word straight up. I would. He
oh,
begrudgingly acknowledges it. He
yeah,
doesn't. He tries his best not to give him that, but he can't help it. He's like, oh yeah, he was
mhm.
hiding all of this from me. I didn't realize. I didn't realize he was this good. He thought
He
he
might,
was calling him like undeveloped and feeble and whatever. I can't remember the exact word, but he was very much downplaying Plagueis' gifts completely
Mm.
throughout all of this. Yeah, before he
he
hopped
can't
into
help
his body.
yeah, he
Yeah.
can't help but give him some credit, even though it really really pains him to do it. But by that same extent, though, once he's in Plagueis, his perception of Plagueis throughout history starts to like he starts to like dart around in history, which leads to his perceptions of things like we mentioned, like the shadow that we obviously can tell is Palpatine, so on and
Hmm.
so forth. Callan, you look like you're about to say something, so I'll pass it to you.
No, it's all right. I was just laughing at something because I'm a child, clearly.
Sexual overtones of the way that you were saying things,
Oh,
but
geez.
For about
Was it?
45 seconds solidly of unintentional sexual overtones. But anyway,
Really? Oh,
aside
yeah,
from the
what did
fact
I
that I'm a
say?
child, yeah,
jumping into someone's body or getting inside somebody. But
deep, pretty
Oh,
deep.
things of
But
that
anyway,
kind.
gracious.
Right.
anyway,
But any,
the
You guys.
but anyway,
putting that distraction aside, the opening up into the future and perceiving that kind of with greater clarity than even he had before. I love the fact that's combined with the begrudging nature of the fact that he's talking. Like you say, he was talking down Plagueis' powers, and
yes.
then so in the same time he's begrudgingly notifying that he taps into it and he's like, "Whoa!" Like I like the fact that the thing he was always priding himself on being the best at is he's proving the fact that Plagueis was better if he had the Bith physiology anyway. In the begrudging moment, it's a good choice of revelation for that character to have to face that, because it comes exactly counter to what he said just previously and what he'd taken the most pride of, as well as the fact that then tapped into the irony of it, because that's obviously what he's blinded himself to. So it's all sweetly wrapped up into a nice little cocktail of I would say tragedy, but I mean obviously the reader doesn't care,
Yeah.
so it's it's more like Schadenfreude, which makes it even better.
Yeah.
As he looks forward and perceives, I can see the moment of Plagueis' death, and I know more importantly that Plagueis isn't going to see it. I think it's a clever way of forcing him to try and abort the plan and get out, and lead into the ultimate downfall that we get to perceive after that.
Yeah. And
That is a
before
great.
we get into the ultimate climax of this though too, I just want to bring this up. I don't know if it's necessarily a continuity flub or anything, but it's like he mentions that when he, I'll try to avoid any sexual innuendos
I was gonna say you just said the
Just
ultimate
lay,
climax.
just
And,
lay
like
it
I mean,
into,
like
just lay it into it.
that was that would
guys.
have been the perfect. Like you should have used that to get us back on track from the previous breakup. But anyway, yeah.
I don't know if it's a continuity flub, but he does kind of allude to the fact that when he's doing this, he might affect Plagueis' ability to perceive the future. But we see in the book that he actually is still capable of doing that. So I don't know if that's I don't know that line always came off a little bit strange to me. I don't know if
It
that
may
actually
be a
causes an
result of him
issue,
having
but
aborted the plan. Like if he'd stuck around, he would have done that, and because he left, it
yeah,
didn't.
I
I think
guess
that's
that's
the
just kind
impression
of,
it gave.
yeah, I guess that is kind of one way to it just I'm not saying it's an issue, it just reads a little bit weirdly depending on
The way I
how
think it
you
works is if it specifically while he came in, Jesus Christ, while
not so easy, is it?
what the hell is this? Anyway, while he had corrupted, let's go with that. While he had corrupted Plagueis, the fact that he tapped into that aspect of the future, he kind of blotted out that part. So he burned through with his maxichlorian corruption that section of Plagueis' foresight, and then when he left and withdrew the corruption back into the air, that then allowed the rest of the foresight to return to Plagueis as a potential and as an ability he has access to. But it permanently scorched out, blotted out, however you want to look at it, that part, so he could never see it coming. I think that works well both as a in-universe explanation for all of that and gets around any potential continuity issues, but also it's a nice, if that was intentional, which I wouldn't put past these two authors at all. I like that helps justify the fact that this character, Plagueis, is the cerebral and scheming and intellectual that we know him to be, was so blindsided by it. Like he had everything else in his life. He's had enough confidence to know that I have enough foresight to see the risk coming. That helps explain why he didn't see that particular risk coming when it did, because he's always been able to rely on his force abilities. He had no idea that this particular moment wasn't going to be reliable for him because it'd been blasted by his master.
Fair
Yeah,
enough.
I also see, just looking through the story here, it does use the word the chosen one. He just never calls him that really. He takes that term from some other word for it, but he was thinking of it as the force-born body, the savior. This it was kind of this savior like kind of figure, even, just very
Mm.
walking his way around what it could be, and just choosing to interpret it the way he does from the Tenebrous side of things, and that kind of predilection is something that I think carries down the Sith generation also to Plagueis. That same kind of mentality of kind of refusing to acknowledge what you're seeing for the longest possible time is another thing, sort of a self
Mm,
delusion. Because Tenebrous says, once his analysis, and this is good, this is jumping back to like apprentice level, like a long time ago, Tenebrous, when he realizes what the game is, what he should be working towards in his mind. Um, it was all there. The numbers could not possibly fail. Once his analysis had been parsed to its nth degree, polished into a gem perfect beyond possibility of flaw, Tenebris had devoted every second, every day of his life to fulfilling his plan. Nothing would be left to chance. He doesn't sleep. Bith don't really sleep, and so like he really means he's like that. That's how devoted he is to this. That's how much he thinks of it. That's how much self regard he has, and he can tell. Yeah, Plagueis is going to be responsible for the creation of this thing. What he doesn't have time to realize, and what Plagueis only really toward the end understands is he didn't do it. The Force did it in response to things he did. And that to me is the only reason why the whole Chosen One thing even works.
Mm.
That is the best use of the Chosen One prophecy for one, the self-fulfillment of it, that aspect of it. Without that, it's just, and people said this when the Phantom Menace came out. Why
Mm.
is Immaculate Conception in here? Why is he Jesus? Why
Exactly.
is Anakin this?
It's the
It's
most
completely out of nowhere.
it's the only really interesting part of prophecy as a narrative construct anyway, as a choice for writers. If you don't play with the perception of it from in world to do with the characters, how they're reacting to it, how they're interacting with it, how their perspectives on it shape it, the end results of it, all that stuff. If you're not using that, then the entire concept of prophecy in a narrative is basically pointless.
Yes.
I mean, not even beside the fact it's been done to death a billion times. If you're not playing in that space, it's a non-choice. It may as well not be there, which as it was in the
Yeah.
films, basically. So yeah, having
Yeah.
this, that was my favorite things about Plagueis as a story. That one of his greatest choices was having it be not just the fact that it was a reaction to what they were doing, the Force and the
Yeah.
Force ritual that Sidious and Plagueis were taking part in. Not only was that being what caused Anakin a genius concept, but also the fact that it was foreknown as a risk by Plagueis. The fact that he went into that expecting the Force to fight back, knowing that something could go wrong, just not really appreciating how wrong
Always
it could have
believing he
gone.
could be
yeah.
ready for it. He would be
Yeah,
he would be equal or
exactly.
more to the task. Yes.
Yeah, I love that
And
about it. It was
also,
all
by the
wrapped
way,
up so
can we
perfectly in
just
the
say
idea of the Sith and him in particular.
Mm,
this is the difference between legends and canon, by the way, because
Mm.
there's some comic panel, I don't know really what it's from, and maybe it's not supposed to be taken literally, but I think it's awful just seeing it. There's a comic panel of like a thought bubble around like Shmi Skywalker on like Tatooine or someplace, which already seems wrong because she was introduced there after Anakin was born. And there's like a thought bubble of like Darth Sidious doing ooga booga magic to create her baby and her pregnancy. And I'm just like, this is completely like
I
this is
really
just
hope
lesser.
that's not
You know what I
real.
mean?
I really hope
Like
that's not real.
it
God.
is real. I don't know that it's taken into the I don't know whether it's been gainsaid by larger continuity, but I'm not making this up. It's not a fan made
Ooh.
thing. It's
You never know
something
these
that
days.
exists in some modern continuity comic strip. Or at least
And
if
we
it's not
see no
that, it looks
wept.
professionally made. Yeah, exactly. So it's like that's why you can't reconcile the two things. Things like that are there's no point in trying. This is just a far more artful, superior, wonderful story,
Yeah,
tapestry of
but
stories,
yeah,
you know.
you,
But
yeah,
anyway,
but you guys want to move into the
yeah,
ending of
don't
this
call
and
it
the
that
oath?
again. Yes. Yeah.
Made sure, made sure.
Or do. I don't care. But just know
Okay,
that's what's happening.
goodness gracious me.
Okay, so that leads us really into a discussion of how this story ends, which is a devastating revelation. I don't know if we want to use the word tragedy because
It's far too much
I think
Schadenfreude for it to be called a tragedy here.
yeah.
It's
Also, Plagueis already kind of has the monopoly on the whole
have you ever
tragedy
heard
thing.
the tale of Darth Tenebrous the Dumb? Yeah, no. Definitely not the same situation here.
Yeah. So, Evan, why don't you tell us what exactly happens here?
Well, essentially, it's both a moment of clarity and a moment of horror wrapped into one. Because as we were
They often
saying,
coincide, yeah.
yeah, when he's sort of seeing Plagueis's, death at the hands of Sidious, or not what he perceives as this great shadow who is obviously Sidious, he freaks out because he realizes that, oh no, he's going to die before I could put my plans into fruition. So he decides to, abort mission, abort mission. So he essentially, his Maxichlorians and his consciousness, he forces his consciousness back to what he thinks is the present, and then exits Plagueis's, body. And he thinks to himself, like, okay, like maybe I can, because again, this is just him as like a spirit or whatever you want to call it. He's like panicking because he's thinking
Yeah.
to himself, like, oh no, what do I do? What do I do? Maybe Plagueis will sense me. Maybe there's a way, I could come back, so on and so forth. And when he comes to that revelation, he then suddenly realizes that when he tries to sense Plagueis, he's no longer around. And then when he kind of looks around, he sees his body, but his body is incredibly decayed. And he sort of comes to this revelation that a very, 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 very long time has passed since
So,
his
can I say just
sure, go ahead.
a gentle correction? He's been mummified. It's
Mm.
like these are this is thousands of years, centuries at the very least of time have gone by.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah,
just decay. Yeah, he's a rock
yeah.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. And he sort of comes to this horror that the virus that he made to essentially create the Maxichlorians had essentially mutated, and his perceptions are now essentially on loop because everything he had experienced up until this point, led to this, and he sees, how long has happened, and he sort of comes to the horrifying, revelation that wait, is this the first time I've experienced this, or is this the second, the third, the hundredth,
Millionth,
millionth, the
billionth,
billionth?
yeah.
And the horror really, I mean, just the way this is written, because it basically ends on him saying, he really wishes he still had a mouth because he really, really needed to scream.
Mhm.
And just the pure horror of that. And then this is something the story itself does very cleverly, is it starts to replay the first few lines from the Tenebrous Way at the very end to show that the cycle is essentially restarting, and Tenebrous has essentially confined himself to, well, an eternal hell, more or less.
With absolutely no way of escaping, unfortunately, for him.
Yeah, he was actually kind of begging for there to be the slightest chance that Plagueis could kind of perceive him so he could end him. That would be better
Yeah,
than this.
and then he realized
That's
that
how
Plagueis is
desperate this
long dead
was.
at that point himself. So
Yeah,
yeah, there's literally
yeah.
no chance short of someone
So
like
is the
Luke
shadow by
Skywalker
that point,
stumbling.
like all
Yeah,
of it. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Anything
The
would be
one
everything's
better
Sith
than
have
gone.
come and gone,
Short of
yeah,
someone
all
like
of
Luke
it.
Skywalker walking above and sensing him and coming down to solve the problem,
He's dead.
it's not
He's
going to
gone.
happen.
probably
That's
we
already
don't.
happened,
Probably
you
we
know.
don't. Yeah, we don't get an actual number, but yeah, it could be very well be thousands of years into the future. It's nuts.
The
I
lesson
do
we
really like the
learned:
use
don't
of the
mess with
language
midichlorians. The Force will fight
when
back, and it will
he
fight back hard.
well,
Yeah,
don't yeah, basically don't mess with the force because it always
Mm.
comes to this in so many way. But I mean, it's just I love the use of the language when he starts realizing Plagueis is gonna die before I can make use of this. He says uh, he would allow his own apprentice to kill him too soon. This could not be. It could not be contemplated, much less allowed to come to pass. Fury competed with panic as Tenebrous threw his mind at the future, seeking to understand how it was Plagueis would be so complacent, so foolish, so blind. And the whole thing is him realizing his own blindness. Like it's just it's a great it's a great use of the language, and it's so
Particularly in the
lofty, and at the
exact
same
reflection
time,
of the fact that how could he be so
yeah,
foolish to let his apprentice kill him so soon? Like it's like
yeah,
it's exactly what you just did, and the only escape he's got is
yeah,
that it was always going to happen that
Yeah.
way. Like, was it though,
And
or is
yeah.
that something that you've just created yourself because you've seen it and made actualized it? Yeah,
that's what they, well,
And I also really
they come
like
up
that a
with
lot.
fate to excuse a lot of their own, like,
they do.
bringing it on.
Shortcomings.
Yeah, yeah.
But I also like though too is like how what exactly is happening. There's still quite a bit that can be left up to interpretation, and I like that. I like that it kind of preserves the mysticism because basically all we get is like, oh, the Maxichlorians somehow mutated, but how that transferred into a potentially eternal loop is never exactly laid out. Which again, I think I like that because it kind of preserves the mystical aspect. If there was like a one-to-one explanation for why this is going on, I feel like it would have kind of taken away from it. You can also somewhat interpret it too as like him throwing his mind into the future so far and so quickly and so haphazardly that it essentially like double backed on itself. That's kind of the interpretation I got when I was rereading this. But again, I like that it's just enough is explained for you to realize the horror of what's going on, but it's still left vague enough to where you could come to your own conclusions. I like that. It's a good balance, you know.
It's playing with ideas that I'm sure have proper names given from scientists with, like, quantum theory and
Mm.
temporal understanding that I don't have. But there's like a certain school of thought that you may never know that you're dead. Sorry to those of you who believe in like an afterlife. I'm not saying you're wrong. I don't know. I haven't died yet. At least I don't think so. And if I have, I can't tell. That's the point. It's sort of like the idea is there's no real place for your consciousness to go except to the beginning. So from your perspective, you're living this eternal illusion. You'll never know. You're already dead. You are already
That's
gone. All
that's
of
the
this is
one saving
happening.
grace within
You
the
know,
story as well is that
yeah.
it's not truly a living hell because he's experienced. Yeah,
Hmm.
the tail end of the loop is, but for the rest of it, is in joy. He's seeing the future. It's not pure hell because he's actually experiencing something that isn't just the dismay and despair at the end because he forgets all of it again by the time the loop comes around.
It
So
goes back to the bliss of dying is
yeah,
wonderful,
exactly.
actually.
Yeah, like the
Yeah.
bliss
Dying is
the bliss
wonderful.
returns.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it
Yeah.
is obviously not something anyone would want. It is an eternal hell, but at least he's not perpetually aware of it. There are other explorations of this concept in fiction where you are perpetually aware. I mean,
This
people
is
talk about
also
concepts of fates
this
worse than
is
death. Anyone who doesn't think there's something worse than death or something simple like torture lacks a hell of an imagination because my God,
sure,
there are things that
but
can be
if you're
worse
a,
than that.
if you're a Sith, though, I will say that there's very little comfort in this. It is a living hell because
Hmm.
you don't find peace in those ideas, and this kind of a revelation, this peeling back of, oh, this is what you are. This is what it is.
Yeah.
If an angel could come down now and say, in whatever religious symbol you could conjure, to come down and explain, someday you're just going to go back to the beginning and keep reliving your life. If you lived a good life, what you reckon to be a good life, maybe that's a wonderful thing.
Hmm.
But if you didn't, it is a living hell, and that's also gives meaning to the simple phrase, ignorance is bliss.
Yeah.
The more you know, sometimes. So
Hmm.
And
it's a
if
wonderful story
yeah,
that's really the genesis of the whole idea. That's the theme of it. Is built around that a little bit too much knowledge for comfort. And we
yeah,
I'm
wouldn't call it a
told
tragedy because it's a terrible Sith, but it's
exactly.
wonderful.
Yeah.
He's a wonderful
yeah,
character. It's a
Yeah,
wonderful way.
it's the
he
perfect
did.
character to be told to have the story
Yeah,
told for as well. We say the same thing about Plagueis with his
Yeah.
story, but this is the kind of Sith. Well, first of all, Sith in general is a good character to tell this from, but also the type of Sith that he is, the type of species that he is, the supremacy, all that stuff. His level of hubris and it's how it manifests works perfectly for this kind of story. It
yeah,
was a
it's the
very well
natural
crafted
conclusion.
short.
Yeah, to what he is, and the fact that they are, like we said, the fact that they were able to pack so much character into such a short narrative is very impressive, and it does make for an excellent companion piece to the Plagueis novelization, especially, I mean, if you even had a passive interest in Tenebrous, reading the actual book, this just enhances it, so many fold, which is great, you know.
Completely agree.
Yeah, there are those who want like a collection or a compendium of all the Rule of Two Sith. That's never going to happen. But I'm not even sure if I really want that because it's nice to have some bits of mystery. Like it's nice to not know everything.
Mm.
But this is a particularly well done deep dive into one of them, and I'm really glad that we have this one. So yeah,
Yeah.
nothing but nice things to say.
Yeah. Well, I hope everyone has enjoyed. Hello, ladies and gentlemen of the internet, and welcome back to Fanalysis Star Wars. I'm Callan. This is Matt.
Hello, welcome.
And this is Evan.
Hello, everyone.
Today, Matt, we are talking about.
We're talking about The Tenebrous Way, which is a short story written by Matthew Stover that was released in Star Wars Insider number 130 in December of 2011, which, as we just spoke about a minute ago.